Alright, this week we are focusing on brainstorming and finding a good question and how to make it narrow but not too broad in scope. Bill Badke writes, "A big reason why research can fail is that the researcher is trying to conquer the world with one project. You simply cannot cover everything about the topic of teenage suicide or abortion or the causes of World War I or why the moon isn't made of green cheese. You have to choose an aspect that is distinct enough that you can really work with it. Otherwise you end up with a superficial survey because you are trying to cover too much." As Bill Badke puts it, you want depth. Avoid questions that survey large amounts of data. Do not go for simple answers that can easily be answered with an encyclopedia article. College professors find encyclopedia-like papers to be boring. Do not try to explain everything about a broad issue. Work to discover things your instructor does not already know. Consider these two types of questions. Wide and shallow. What is the history and geography of Morocco? This question would take a whole book to address adequately. To write 6 to 10 pages on this would only allow for the highlights and would not provide a cohesive focus. This kind of question leads to more of an encyclopedia-like response. Consider a narrow and deep question like this. How did Morocco's role in World War II influence the culture of its people? In contrast with the first question, this one has more direction. It is focused on a particular time period and how the circumstances and events changed this particular country. This would potentially be more interesting than the much broader question about the history and geography of Morocco. So let's think of some quick ways to narrow down our topic. The first way that I'd like to suggest is to limit it by time. You could limit it to a time period, such as the 19th century. You could limit it to the Renaissance period, or the 60s, or a specific year. The sciences and social sciences almost always want the most recent 5 years. So in most cases, throughout your college research, you will focus on the last 5 years, unless you're in a history class, and then you'll focus on different time periods. Borrowing from a previous example, how did Morocco's role in World War II influence the culture of its people, is more focused than a question about World War II and its impact on culture around the world. Remember that a study on how many individuals are affected by skin cancer in Pocatello, Idaho, would still look at skin cancer in the broader population, but focusing on the narrow site location would make it more focused. Here are some other suggestions on how to limit by geography. You could focus on a rural population or an urban population, or even a population that's in between, the suburban population. You could focus on a county, a state, a region, or a full country if you like. This method allows you to focus on a particular age group, race, nationality, or ethnic group. Okay, so Bill Badke talks about how you do not want to re-describe what has already been described. You want to solve a problem. You want to identify a controversy. One way to do this is to ask a narrowed question. So instead of asking a big question like, how can we limit or eliminate teenage drinking, a narrower, more focused question would be, what form of public advertising is best able to reach problem teenage drinkers? Notice that with this last question they are focusing on a specific demographic, teenagers. But the first question is still too big because there are too many possibilities. The second question addresses one solution and asks a more focused question that will have less of a tendency to ramble or lead the researcher to get lost in all the possibilities. As the slide shows, a thesis statement is a tentative answer to a research question. It's the researcher's hypothesis. This is what I think the answer to this question is. Sometimes your professors may ask you to write a thesis statement, and that's what you should do when you write your paper. But at the beginning of the process, I think it's best to work with a research question rather than to decide on a thesis. And the reason why I think that is because if you establish your thesis statement from the get-go, then you have closed off possibilities that you encounter in different sources. You want to be open to the sources that you find. Also keep in mind that a research question leaves the researcher open to receive what he or she finds, and it keeps a researcher from minimizing data or views that are contradictory to their thesis statement. Alright, so a research question might be something like this. To what extent should the U.S. government have known of the risk of the New York 9/11 disaster before it happened? So a research question may invite more of an honest investigation and an open mind. Consider this as a thesis statement. There was sufficient warning of a New York 9/11 type disaster before it happened, so the U.S. government should have been well prepared for its occurrence. Let's think about this. A thesis statement may create bias and lead students to minimize evidence. As you all understand, there are good ones, bad ones, and ugly ones. You want to choose a good research question. Let's take a look at some of the bad ones and think about how to make them better. As many of you may already know, many of these ideas come from William Badke's book, Research Strategies. The question that isn't there. This is a question that leaves the reader to wonder what the purpose of the paper is, and it just surveys the topic. It just gives lots of data. It also might read like an encyclopedia article, and it just regurgitates what everyone knows already. This kind of a paper puts the professor to sleep, and that's not what you want. You want to impress the professor or the instructor, and you want to be able to capture their interest and be able to ask a question that makes them think. Here's another example of a bad question, a fuzzy question. Why was Saddam Hussein the way he was? This kind of a question needs a lot more clarification. We don't know if you're talking about Saddam as a dictator, Saddam and his use of chemical weapons, or his oil strategy, how he treated the Kurds. What is it that you really want? It's hard to really say. Improving this question would involve clarifying that kind of a question. So, why was Saddam Hussein using chemical weapons in the Gulf War? Or perhaps a better question might be, how did Saddam Hussein use the state media to keep the population of his country in check? How did he use the media to promote his message and his views? Bill Badke tells us that we should not allow more than one research question into our research project. One question per research project is all you need or want. Therefore, a question like this is just too diverse. It's asking for too much information. You should narrow it down to something a lot more focused. So you could say something more along the lines of, how could people have foreseen the financial meltdown of 2008? You do want to stick to one question. You don't want to have many questions, and you don't want to be too broad or too vague. There are too many directions you can take with this kind of question. So many answers can be given that a focus can never really be achieved. Badke says to close off the question, put down a wall somewhere and limit yourself a little. With this question, you could change it to something more like, why are teenagers turning away from Facebook? Or, how does Facebook usage affect college students' abilities to perform in college? So change it from an open-ended question to more of a closed question. This is the question that will not fly. It's creative, it sounds like fun, but it's ultimately a question that just can't be answered. So once you've decided on a question, you need to start asking yourself, how could I answer this question? Can it be answered? Ask yourself if you can answer the question. Is there a way to measure the intelligence of teenagers today and compare it with the intelligence of teenagers 40 years ago? Instead, you could focus on the part of the question that fascinates you more. For example, you might ask, how does text messaging influence the way teenagers communicate with each other face to face? Thank you for your attention during this video. This week we want you to work on some of the questions provided in Bill Badke's book and try to improve them. What are some of the characteristics of bad questions? Can you identify the bad question and what makes them bad? Have a good day and we'll talk to you later.